I was born and raised and educated in Canada, and I did not meet Christians till I was 27 years of age. But I was in fact, my parents make the point that as soon as I could talk, and I wasn't really talking until I was 5 years of age, but as soon as I could talk, I was asking questions, and in particular questions about the universe. They claim I was kind of a born scientist. And I remember when I was 7 years of age, asking my parents the question, are the stars hot? And they assured me that the stars were very hot. But of course I wanted to know why they were so hot. And so they told me to go to the library. And that's what I did, and I read every book I could find on astronomy and physics in the children's section of the Vancouver Public Library. And when I had done that and read all the books that were there, they gave me a pass to the adult section. Eventually I wound up getting a pass to the university library. And it was at the age of 8 that I knew that my future career would lie in astrophysics. And from the age of 8 onwards, that was kind of the passion of my life, was pursuing astrophysics. By the time I was in my teenage years, I was beginning a study on what's called cosmology, the origin and structure of the universe. And at that time in the 1960s, there was all these debates about is the universe steady state? Is it oscillating or reincarnating like the Hindus and Buddhists would claim that it is? Or is it a big bang? And there are other descriptions too. But as I went into that study, it became clear to me that the astronomical observations were heavily favoring the Big Bang explanation and disproving the other explanations. And Big Bang cosmology really arose out of Einstein's theory of general relativity, which tells us that the universe is continuously expanding and traceable back to a beginning. And reasoning along the same lines as Albert Einstein, I figured if the universe indeed has a beginning, there must be a beginner. And I came to that conclusion at age 16, and from this 16 onwards, I never doubted the existence of God. So that part was taken care of. And I had the good fortune of going to a high school where we had people from all different cultures and religions. And therefore, when I began to talk to people about how I discovered that this beginner or God exists, I got exposed to a lot of different people from different religious perspectives. And starting at age 17, I decided to do a study of the different religions of the world to see if any of them could possibly be a communication from this cosmic beginner. And what they tell you in science is you should always begin with the easy problems first and leave the most difficult to the end. So on purpose, I began with the philosophers. I knew that Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, was also the father of modern cosmology. So I looked at what he had to write, looked at Descartes and a number of other philosophers, and what I recognized is they thought of space and time as being absolutes that eternally existed. And I knew that Big Bang cosmology disproved that. So I said, these guys really aren't the right way. Then I began to look at what the Hindus had to say. And the Hindus speak about the reincarnating universe, which was a popular idea in the 1960s amongst astronomers, that the universe has multiple beginnings rather than just one beginning, where it would grow from this beginning and then shrink, and then there would be this rebirth. But the Hindus in their Vedas claim that the period of time between the two beginnings would be exactly 4.32 billion years. And even back in the 1960s, we knew that number was definitely wrong. The universe was older than 4.32 billion years. And we also were able to demonstrate that the universe was so entropic, in other words, so efficient in radiating heat from hot bodies to cold bodies, it would allow no possibility for any kind of rebound or bounce mechanism. So at age 17, I recognized that the truth of the universe did not come through Hinduism. And therefore, Hinduism's message could not be compatible with the one that began the universe or created the universe. Now, in the public high school I attended, the dominant religion outside of atheism and agnosticism was Buddhism. Our high school was 80% Asians. And they told me I needed to look at what the Buddhists had to say. So I did that. But I discovered that the Buddhists borrow everything that they teach about cosmology, the origin and structure of the universe, directly from the Hindus. And I said, therefore, the truth is not in Buddhism either. Then I picked up the Quran, and when I began to go through the Quran, I noticed kind of a common denominator here, that the Quran, like the Buddhist writings and the Hindu writings I was being exposed to, were highly repetitious. They kept repeating themselves, and the language was vague. And I guess what concerned me most of all, there was this appeal to intellectual snobbery. If you're one of the great enlightened ones, you'll be able to understand the meaning of this text. Otherwise, you're out of luck. And I said, that's not what I see in the record of nature. When I look out at the universe, I see a revelation there that is clear and direct and ready and open for investigation and testing. And that bothered me, that when I went into these other holy books, I didn't see that direct communication or that invitation to put things to the test. Now, there was one fellow in our high school classroom who was of the Baha'i faith. And what he told me is that in Baha'i, what they do is that they take the kernels of truth from the world's great religions and put them together into a consistent package. So it says, great, show me what you got. And as I spent a few days looking at the Baha'i teachings, I went back to my friend and said, well, from what I can tell, what the Baha'i have done is to borrow the great mistakes in the world's religions and to put them together into an inconsistent package. And he wound up leaving the Baha'i faith. Now, when I told you earlier that I didn't meet Christians until I was 27 years of age, what I meant by that was to get close enough to a Christian where I could have a conversation on some spiritual matter. That did not happen until I was 27. And that's because in Canada, there just aren't as many Christians as there are here in the United States. They're harder to meet. However, I did get to see two Christians from 30 feet away when I was 11 years old. And these were two businessmen that came into our public school classroom and put a box on our teacher's desk. And in that box were Gideon Bibles. And we're all invited to come forward and take one if we wanted one. And I still carry around with me that Gideon Bible I picked up when I was 11 years of age. Now, I didn't read it until I was 17. It stayed untouched on my bookshelf for 6 years. And in hindsight, I'm rather glad that I did not pick it up until I was 17, because those Gideons gave me what we would call a foreign language edition of the Bible. It's King James English. And at age 11, I think I would have been quite intimidated. But one of the benefits of a Canadian public education is starting in grade 7, they saturate you with the plays of William Shakespeare. And I had to memorize literally over 1,000 lines from the different plays of William Shakespeare. So by the time I was 17, I was fluent in King James English. And as I began to go through this book, I noticed immediately how different it was from all the other holy books that undergird the religions of the world. Namely, that it was clear, it was direct, and it was specific. Unlike these other holy books, I didn't see a lot of repetition or vagueness. It mentions places, points of history and science and geography, things that could easily be put to the test. And I think what encouraged me as a young scientist as I began to go through this book, I found repeated invitations to put this to the test. For example, we have in the writings of the Apostle Paul in 1 Thessalonians 5:21, everything must be tested. Hold fast to that which is good. And again, this is repeated throughout the Bible. And the Bible is the only holy book I picked up that ever had this invitation to objectively put what you're reading to the test. And, I began on page 1. I thought, I want to get the Genesis 1. By the way, the Gideons did not give me anything except the Psalms, Proverbs, and the New Testament. So I wound up getting a complete Bible, started in page 1. And I went through Genesis chapter 1. I found the scientific method. Now, I've been trained in Canada from grade 1 forward. Every year of school, we were taught the scientific method. But they never told us where the scientific method came from. And when I opened up Genesis 1, I found the elements of the scientific method built right into the text. And this had a huge impression upon me as a 17-year-old studying science. And let me just review for you what I found in Genesis chapter 1. First of all, the step 1 of the scientific method is to make no attempt to interpret until you first establish the frame of reference. And so we need to identify the frame of reference. In fact, Galileo said at his trial that the biggest mistake you can make in Bible interpretation is to fail to identify the frame of reference. And you say, where do you see that? Well, notice Genesis 1:2, before you get into the 6 creation days. It tells us that the Spirit of God is hovering over the surface of planet Earth. So it tells us that we are to interpret the sequence of the events in the 6 creation days from the perspective of an observer on the surface of planet Earth. So it's not looking down on the planet, it's being on the planet, looking up at the clouds and looking across the surface. And that makes a huge difference in how you interpret the events of the 6 creation days. Now, step 2 of the scientific method is to determine the initial conditions. Make no attempt to interpret until you establish those initial conditions. What else do you see in Genesis 1:2? The Spirit of God is hovering over the surface of the waters, and it's empty of life, unfit for life. The water covers the whole surface of the planet, and it's dark upon the surface of the waters. So those are the 4 initial conditions. And then you go through the 6 creation days. Now, as you go through those 6 creation days, the 3rd step of the scientific method that we teach our students, do not try to interpret when you do your experiment or make your observations, or in this case, read the biblical text. Simply note what happens, where it happens, when, the order, and then you write that down in a notebook. And when you're all done, well, you want to note the final conditions. And having noted those final conditions, now and only now are you free to make an interpretation. But it's an interpretation you make lightly. And then you want to test that interpretation with other observations and experiments. And this is one of the beautiful things I found about the Bible, is that it's loaded with many creation accounts. And what you find in the other holy books might be 1 creation account or 2, but in the Bible we have 25 different accounts of creation. Now, having done that, kind of looked at that scientific method outline, by the way, the Bible follows that pattern every time it describes a sequence of physical events. And it wasn't until I was 27 years of age and began to read the writings of the Scottish theologian Thomas Torrance and the 28-volume set his Scottish academic press put out on science and the Christian faith that I discovered that the scientific method really came directly from the Bible. That was the birth of the scientific revolution. It's no accident that the scientific revolution came out of the Reformation and Western Europe. It was Bible scholars reading the Bible, discovering this method, and applying it to their scientific research, and that was the birth of the scientific revolution. So it does come straight from the pages of the Bible. Now, following this biblical method, so the Bible tells us everything must be put to the test, but it also tells you how to put it to the test. And when you do that, this is the order of events you get for Genesis chapter 1. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The word in the Hebrew for heavens and earth is shamayan ares, which means the entire physical universe. The Hebrew word for earth has 5 different literal definitions. The Hebrew word for heaven has 3 different literal definitions. But the word shamayan ares is kind of like our English word butterfly. Butterfly's got nothing to do with butter or fly. It means something very different. Likewise, heavens plural attached to earth singular means something different. It means the entire physical universe encompassing all matter, energy, space, and time. In the beginning, God created. The verb there, bara, means to create something brand new that never existed before. Entirely compatible with the Big Bang singularity, which tells us that there's an actual beginning of matter, energy, space, and time. Genesis 1 starts off with that claim. Now, this is important because when you look at the other holy books of the religions of the world, they speak about God or gods creating within space and time that always exists. The Bible gives a radically different message, that God creates independent of space and time. And so space and time are created when God creates the universe. Then we notice that the frame of reference shifts from the universe as a whole to the surface of planet Earth. So we go from Genesis 1:1 to 1:2. It shifts our point of view from the universe down to the surface of planet Earth with those four initial conditions. And then we begin with the first creation day, let there be light. Notice the text does not say that God created the light. He says, let the light be. It's dark on the surface of the waters because the light of the universe is not able to come through the atmosphere of planet Earth to penetrate to the waters. So it's dark because of the fact that the clouds prevent the light of the sun, for example, from penetrating through the clouds. But let there be light is a statement of how God transforms the early atmosphere of planet Earth so that that atmosphere is no longer opaque to light, but is transparent or translucent for light. Now, I grew up in coastal British Columbia. Translucent skies is kind of what we had all the time. Hardly ever saw the sun, but we could see the light from the sun as it would diffuse through those clouds. So that's what happened on creation day 1. Let there be light. God transformed the atmosphere, and now photosynthesis could begin on the surface of the earth in the waters. Keep in mind, there's water over the whole surface of the earth, no continents at this point. Creation day 2, again, does not use the word create. It says, let there be waters above and waters below. The waters below referring to the liquid water that was all over the surface of the earth, the water above referring to the water vapor atmosphere, and this is a statement of God setting up a stable water cycle where you got water in the atmosphere above, liquid water below, and they circulate one from the other. And this is something that was critical that God performed a miracle in order to prepare for the watering of the future continental land masses. Then you move into creation day 3, and it begins by talking about how God gathers the water. And now, instead of having an ocean that covers the whole surface of the earth, we have oceans and continents. Land masses begin to appear. And then dasha, let the land masses produce plants. Now the verb dasha there could be interpreted that God supernaturally created the plants, or that he worked through the natural process to bring about the plants, or a combination of the two. This is an example of where the scriptures do not give us a clear answer about how to resolve the creation-evolution debate. However, you'll be hearing in further lectures that indeed it was supernatural intervention, not simply God working through the natural process to bring about these plants upon the continental land masses. Then we move into creation day 4, and it says, let there be the great lights. Notice the text does not say that God created the great lights. He says, let the great lights be. So we have the sun, moon, and stars for the first time becoming visible to the observer on the surface of the earth. In other words, this is when the atmosphere gets transformed from being permanently translucent to at least occasionally being transparent, where observers can now see the objects responsible for the light. And in verse 15, which follows the 14th verse, where it says, let there be the great lights, verse 15 says, so that they may serve to mark seasons and years. And for whom? Well, for all the creatures that are going to show up on creation days 5 and 6. And on creation days 5 and 6, the text talks about God creating life forms that need the visibility, at least on occasion, of the sun, moon, and stars to regulate their complex biological clocks. And that would apply to anything more advanced than a clam. Clams need the occasional visibility of the sun, moon, and stars. And so before the 5th creation day, we have these more primitive creatures. After creation day 4, we have these advanced creatures that need that visibility. Then we have the 16th verse, which says, so God made the sun, moon, and stars, but the verb asa is in the completed form, letting us know that the sun, moon, and stars were completed before the 4th day. It doesn't tell us exactly when, but that God had created them previously to that 4th creation day. Genesis 1:1 would tell us in the beginning, before the 6 creation days. And then we move into creation day 5, where it talks these swarms of small sea creatures. And I believe this is a reference to the Cambrian explosion of life, where you have the sudden burst of complex life in many different forms. It shows up all at once. And then it talks about God creating birds and sea mammals towards the end of creation day 5. Soulish creatures. In other words, what we have is simply physical life for the first 4 creation days. Creation day 5 is the first time that we see soulish life. Life that's not purely physical, but soulish. Soulish in the sense that God imbues these creatures with mind, will, and emotions so they can relate to one another, but also relate to the future human beings. And then in creation day 6, it talks about how God creates 3 specialized kinds of land mammals. Creation day 5 talks about birds and sea mammals generically. Creation day 6 does not talk about land mammals generically, but rather focuses on 3 specialized kinds of land mammals, those that God specifically created to cohabit the planet with humanity. Then last of all, it talks about God creating the human species, male and female. And it uses asa bara, just like with the soulish creatures. When God created the soulish creatures, there's something about them that he manufactured supernaturally, but there's something in them that's totally brand new. What was manufactured would have been the physical component. What's brand new would be the spirit. Well, likewise with humanity. We are supernaturally manufactured by God from the dust of the earth, from what previously existed, but there's something in us that's brand new. We're the only species that God created, according to Genesis 1, that's body, soul, and spirit. And and that gives us the capacity to communicate with God himself. We're the only species that's given that capacity to ask questions like, who am I? Who created me? Why am I here? How can I have a relationship with my Creator? That's the spirit component within us. Now, as a young man of 17, it kind of took me about 4 hours to figure all that out. I was kind of going through all my textbooks and checking it out, but what I discovered was this, that here was an account of creation. The first account of creation I'd read in any of the holy books that actually fit what the record of nature revealed. When I was 9 years old, I read a book on creation myths, and it talked about over 100 different creation stories in different cultures of the world. Well, they were good for a laugh, and what they were talking about was just absurd in terms of what the record of nature revealed to us. But the one that came the closest to what the actual record of nature was revealing was the Enuma Elish of the Babylonians. And that's an account of creation that mentions 14 creation events, and it gets 2 out of 14 right. 12 wrong, 2 right. But when I picked up this Bible, what I found was an account of 13 creation events. All 13 were correctly described, and all 13 were in the correct chronological sequence. Now, the probability of Moses getting it in the correct order, even if he was given the correct information, that probability would be 1 chance in 13 factorial. That's 1 chance in 13 times 12 times 11 times 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You can figure that out while you're listening to me. It's a very small probability. But an even tinier probability is that Moses actually got all 13 events correctly described in the correct chronological sequence. So at age 17, that was my first clue that this book may be different from the other holy books in that it could actually be a communication from the being that created the universe. How else could Moses have possibly gotten it that accurate if he didn't have some inspired information from the creator of the universe himself? But I kept on going. And what I discovered as I kept moving is that there are many creation accounts in the Bible. In fact, there are 25 chapter length or longer creation accounts in the Bible. Now, what I found in the other holy books at best was just 1 or 2 creation accounts. Here I found 25. So here was an opportunity for me to put to the test my interpretation of Genesis 1. And I was very curious, does the rest of the Bible support this? And so I began to go through these texts and actually try to put my interpretation to the test. Let me just give you a couple of examples of how that worked out for me as a young man. Job 38 and 39, for example, take you through all the events of the 6 creation days. They're not numbered like they are in Genesis chapter 1, but it literally describes all the events and actually gives us more scientific detail about the events of the 6 creation days than you find in Genesis chapter 1. But for example, in Job 38, verses 8 and 9, we have God saying to Job, I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness, it referring to the oceans that encompass the earth. So what it's telling us here in Job 38, that the reason why it was dark on the surface of the waters of the early planet Earth is because God had wrapped the planet in this blanket that kept it dark. So it supports the interpretation that indeed God had created these sun, moon, and stars at the beginning, but their light was not getting through to the surface of the waters because of this dark cloud layer. So whereas Genesis 1 implies it, what we see in Job 38 is an explicit statement supporting that interpretation. Now, one of the things I noticed in my first reading of Genesis 1 is that when you go through these creation days, it brackets each day by an evening and a morning. And I expected to see that follow through the entire text, but that did not happen. The first 6 days are bracketed by an evening and a morning, but not the 7th day. When you get to the 7th day in Genesis 1, there's no evening and morning. And so, reading that for the first time, I said, then we must be in the 7th day if indeed there is no start point and end point described in the text for the 7th day. We must still be in the 7th day. That's why there's no evening and morning for the 7th day. Well, when you read one of the New Testament creation accounts in Hebrews 4, for example, we have this statement. He has spoken about the 7th day, referring to God. They shall never enter my rest. It still remains that some will enter that rest. So what we notice here in Hebrews, it's referring to the 7th day of creation in the present tense and in the future tense. So we're still in that 7th day. Now, one of the things that have bothered me ever since I was 10 years old is what I refer to as a fossil record enigma. Now, the fossil record enigma is that before humans come upon the scene, we see in the fossil record extensive evidence for both speciation events and extinction events. New life forms coming into existence and old life forms disappearing from existence. But as soon as humans come upon the scene, all we see are the extinctions, not the speciation events, only extinctions. And that had bothered me ever since I was 10. How come there's this difference between what happens before human beings and what happens after human beings? Well, I got a very satisfying answer to that out of Genesis chapter 1. Namely, what we see in Genesis chapter 1 is that for 6 days, God creates. On the 7th day, he stops creating. He rests. So for 6 creation periods, we have God creating these new species of life. But on the 7th day, he stops creating new species of life. When he created Adam and Eve, this is when he rested from his work of creation. So according to Genesis 1, we don't see speciation events today because God is at rest. He's not creating new species. Whereas we see it in the past because that's when God was actively creating. Now, another creation account that actually takes you through all the events of the 6 creation days is Psalm 104. Again, it doesn't number the days, but like Job 38 and 39, actually gives you much more scientific content about what's happening in those 6 creation days than what you would get in Genesis chapter 1. So there's another opportunity to test one's interpretation of Genesis chapter 1. And when you see towards the end of Psalm 104 is that life dies off, but that God recreates. God replaces the life forms that go extinct with new life forms that are better adapted to the changing earth and the changing sun. So here's an explicit statement backing up this fossil record enigma that it's the property of all life to die off or go extinct. That happens just through thermodynamics and gravity and electromagnetism. Laws of physics will guarantee that over time. but that God replaces the life forms that go extinct with new life forms by supernatural intervention. Now, I'll give you a little insight on that. This is not something I was aware of at age 17, but it's something we've become aware of since. There's a good reason for why we see this in Scripture, because of what's called the faint sun paradox. That if we look at the sun over the course of its history, when it's very young, it loses mass at a fairly good clip. It was about 7% more massive than it is today. And the luminosity of a star goes up with the fourth power of its mass. So during the early part of the sun's history, it would dim considerably. It would actually dim by 15%. So it was about as bright as it is today when it started off, and then became 85% as bright. But what happened in the core of the sun is that we had temperature conditions there which would fuse hydrogen into helium. And this is really where the sun gets its energy today, is from hydrogen fusion. But the more hydrogen that gets fused into helium, then the more powerfully that furnace will burn. And so what happens is, over the course of the hydrogen burning in the sun, it gets hotter and hotter and hotter as more and more hydrogen gets converted into helium. Helium is a catalyst for the furnace. And so we understand today that the sun went from 100% of its brightness down to 85%, then from 85% back up to 100%. Now, life can only tolerate a 1% change in the sun's luminosity. So, well, how did God deal with this? The way God dealt with it is He created just the right life forms at just the right time. So those life forms would pull greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere or add greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And by controlling the atmosphere by the different life forms that God creates, He is able to keep the surface of planet Earth at the ideal temperature for life throughout the entire history of life here on planet Earth. Now, the planet today is spinning 5 times more slowly than it did when God first created life. And so that kind of explains why we only see bacteria first. Bacteria can handle a 4 or 5 hour rotation rate. We can't. Our bodies would be just sheared to bits by wind forces that would be engendered by that rapid rotation. And so we see here in Psalm 104 is a God understanding exactly how the physics of the earth and the sun will change over time, creates exactly the right life forms at just the right time and just the right diversity and abundance in order to keep everything perfectly balanced for life here on planet Earth. And this also requires that He remove occasionally those life forms that would no longer be appropriate to keeping things in the best fit situation. Well, we have these 25 creation accounts in the Bible. And I went through those 25 creation accounts over the course of about 18 months. From the time I was 17 to the time I was 19, I determined that the Bible had made over 200 accurate predictions of future scientific discoveries. Keep in mind, for example, the Bible speaks in 11 different places of a continuously expanding universe from the creation event, where you got this beginning of space and time. No astronomer, no philosopher had any clue about the beginning of space and time at the beginning of the universe. Neither did they have any clue that the universe was continuously expanding. None of that became public knowledge until 1917, when Albert Einstein developed this theory of general relativity. And what we see here is the Bible authors, going all the way back to Job, were already communicating to us about these detailed cosmic characteristics. So this is an example where the Bible was thousands of years ahead of its time, accurately predicting future scientific discoveries. And so I kind of did a back of an envelope calculation when I turned 19 about what would be the probability that these Bible authors could predict these future scientific discoveries without any inspiration or knowledge or communication from the God that created the universe. And I determined that that probability had to be much less than 1 chance in 10 to the 300. Now that's 300 zeros after the 1. And that same week at the University of British Columbia, our physics professor had given us the assignment to calculate the probability that one of the students in the class would be killed by sudden reversal of the second law of thermodynamics. It was a class in statistical mechanics. And I can tell you the probability is very tiny, but he wanted us to calculate what that probability was. And I'm going to try to help you get through that. In this auditorium here, we have quadrillions of air molecules. And the physicists here in the audience will tell you that those air molecules are all at different temperatures. For example, within this room, there are trillions of air molecules that are below the freezing point of water. And so there's a tiny statistical probability that those trillions of air molecules below the freezing point of water will, within the next 5 seconds, wander in the vicinity of where this young lady is sitting and freeze her to death. And we had to calculate what that probability was. Well, it turns out that that probability is only 1 chance in 10 to the 80th. Such an extremely tiny probability that this young lady would be fully justified in concluding it's never going to happen. In fact, the point of our professor was to tell us or communicate to us there's no way, given how tiny that probability is, that there ever could be such a reversal of the second law of thermodynamics anytime, anywhere in the entire universe, geography and history. It just won't happen. That probability is so tiny. Well, what I realized is that I had just demonstrated to myself that this book we call the Bible is at least 10 to the 200 times more reliable than the second law of thermodynamics. And this is what brought me to a point of decision. I realized that it was not rational for me to trust my life moment by moment in the reliability of the second law of thermodynamics and not put even greater trust and confidence in the reliability of what's written here in this book. And thank God for the Gideons. In every one of the Bibles they give away, they have 2 pages at the end that tell you what you need to do once you become persuaded that this book here indeed is the error-free Word of God. And the first thing I read in those 2 pages is that they tell me that God demands a standard of moral perfection. And that's one of the reasons why I was attracted to this book. Of all the holy books I read, this had the most beautiful and elegant description of how God wanted us to behave. And I made a commitment at age 17, maybe a foolish one, where I said I'm going to do everything I can to live up to the moral standard of this book. But the harder I tried, the more miserable I felt. The more I became aware I was falling short of God's standard of moral perfection. And the Gideons pointed out to me that's the conscience that God gives us. God writes His law in the heart of every human being. And that law tells us that God's standard is one of perfection and we can't make it. But that God is a God of love, and how He sent His Son, the creator of the universe Himself, to live here on planet Earth as a human being. And in that humanity, He lived a life of moral perfection. And I said, yeah, the Gideons are right, because I remember reading the gospel accounts where Jesus of Nazareth would give a sermon in front of a large audience. And He would tell people in those sermons that He was morally perfect. And His mother was in the audience agreeing with Him. I said, you're not going to fool your mom. And His brothers and sisters were there too. So I said, this guy had to be morally perfect. Yet in that moral perfection, He took upon Himself the penalty for our moral imperfections by dying a death on the cross. And as the Gideons point out, what Jesus, the creator of the universe, has done is to make an offer to every human being to trade His moral perfection for our moral imperfection. And I said, that's a great deal. And the Gideons don't let you off the hook. In the back of every one of their Bibles, they've got a place for you to sign your name and date it, making your commitment to have Jesus Christ be the boss of your life, the Lord of your life, and your Savior. And so I signed my name to that. And the last thing the Gideons communicated there is to say, when you make that commitment to make the creator of the universe your Lord and your personal Savior, then God will send you the Holy Spirit to help you do the things that you can't do on your own. He'll give you the desire to live the Christian life and the power to live the Christian life, not all at once, it's step by step. Well, the very next day I saw that laid out, because I had been studying the Christian faith in total secrecy, because I was surrounded by unbelievers, including my own family. So I kept it all secret. But when I read through this book, I realized anyone that makes a commitment to Jesus Christ is committing himself as well to share what they've discovered with others. And so I picked on my lab partner as my first victim. And he could tell I wanted to talk. And he says, Hugh, please, I need to talk today. He says, I've been going through personal struggles in my life that I've not talked to anyone about. I really need to talk to somebody who knows something about God. Do you know anybody in this campus that knows anything about God? And so I got to share with them my own study. And we taught for 4 hours that day, had many conversations. And I got to see several of my fellow students and professors come to faith in Christ. But it was really at Caltech, after I got my PhD, where I met Christians. You know, in Canada, they're hard to find. In the United States, they're everywhere. And it was at Caltech that I ran into astronomers who were Christians. They told me how to find a church that wasn't a cult, that took the Bible seriously. And I found one of those churches. And they had me begin teaching classes on how to use science as a tool to bring people who've never had contact with a Christian faith to Christ. And it was that church that actually helped me launch New Reasons to Believe, an organization founded to develop new reasons to believe.